Då vill jag önska er alla varmt välkomna till ännu ett seminarium i vår serie Öppna upp för innovation, som fokuserar på perspektiv och processer som ska stärka Sveriges förmåga att möta samhällsutmaningar. Jag vill också rikta ett väldigt varmt välkommen till er som följer oss nu på webben, både er i realtid och er som kanske tittar på det här i efterhand. För som ni alla ska veta så bandar vi det här, så tveka inte att sprida då den här länken som vi har på vår hemsida om ni tycker att det är värt att göra det här. Jag vill också passa på att nämna att nästa seminarium i vår serie kommer äga rum den 27 juni. Och temat då är digitala ekosystem i transformation. Slutligen, innan vi börjar, så vill jag också säga att vi kommer skicka ut en enkät efter det här, och vi hoppas att ni ska hjälpa till och bidra med er feedback så att vi ska kunna vidareutveckla det här konceptet. Kom gärna med tips på teman som ni känner angelägna. Jag heter Ann Lidgard och jag har fått nöjet att få vara moderator här idag. Här på Vinnova så jobbar jag bland annat med frågor som rör just systemtransformation och metoder för detta. Dagens tema handlar ju precis om detta, och det är missions och missionsinriktat arbete. Och vi ska strax få lära oss lite mer om hur det kan stärka vår förmåga här i Sverige att möta de stora samhällsutvecklingarna och leda till systemtransformation. Men inte bara i Sverige utan även utanför Sveriges gränser, och kanske till och med tillsammans med våra nordiska grannar. Visa på riktigt nordiskt ledarskap i den här frågan. Dagens talare är Dan Hill som är systemdesigner här på Vinnova. And I think I might as well switch to English right away, right? Dan joined the Vinnova executive team earlier this year in January as head of strategic design. And I must say, on a personal note, I'm extremely happy, I think most of us are, to see that Dan joined us, given his vast experience in this field. Dan has worked with nobody less than really the thought leader in this area, Professor Mariana Mazzucato herself, who through her work has coined and also developed the whole concept of missions in the context that we are about to learn more about. But prior to joining Vinnova, Dan has also worked extensively in other parts of the world with systems design, having worked in Australia, in Finland, in the Netherlands, and I believe also in the US. Tell me if I've missed a few countries on the globe. But in any case, so without further delay, please join me in welcoming the Director of Strategic Design of Vinnova, Dan Hill.
Tack. Tusen tack. I didn't have my microphone on because I just went to the bathroom, and that would have been very embarrassing. What an English thing to say. So I am here to open you up for innovation, apparently. So yes, apologies for speaking in English, and also apologies in advance for speaking quickly in English as well, which I'm going to do. So I know that's double annoying. But I'm going to show you lots of pictures at least, just to make up for it. And I'll go quite quickly, as I said, on the basis that it's a bit like a shotgun or something. I might hit at least one of you with something interesting at some point. And if you find that, then please come back afterwards and ask me to find out more about it. This is my intention here, to sort of give you lots of angles on this matter, on the basis that that will at least attract some of you to come and talk to us more about this, because we're just at the start of things here, so it's a good time to get involved. So and it's going to be sort of in two parts. I'm going to talk about this idea of missions and where they come from, sort of the theory of it, if you like, and then I'm going to talk a lot about the practice, and the practice in particular of this kind of work around strategic design. So the way that we can use design to approach governance, policy making, innovation, the questions behind things, not just the delivery of something, but why in the first place. So it's going to be a little bit like that, but I'll try and make the theory bit at least a bit interesting as well. We'll see. And as Anne said, I'm new to Sweden, although I've done lots of work in the Nordic region over the years, and I lived and worked in Helsinki for a couple of years, working at Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. So some of the work comes from this understanding of the Nordics a little bit, but of course I've been finding out about Sweden with a lot of my colleagues here, asking them annoying, naive questions all the time, but also reading around it. And I found this amazing book from 1936 by Marcus Childs, who is an American journalist and writer called Sweden, the Middle Way. And he was writing just almost on we talk about the shift from sort of farms to cities and from agriculture to industry, and the emergence of the Nordic model and the emergence of modern Sweden, 20th century Sweden, and particularly obviously by the 1950s, the 1960s and 70s, an economic and social and cultural powerhouse that had a much bigger punch than you would expect from 9.6 million people or whatever we are. So he was writing at the start of that, and it's fascinating as a result for him to write about the emergence of these systems, the way these negotiations come from between trade unions and collectives and industry and policy and so on. And there's an interesting line in the middle of it about this bit here, about capitalism has been modified and controlled, and sometimes even curbed and sometimes abolished, dare we say. But it's, to a considerable degree, it is true that the domestic economy has been made to serve the greatest good of the greatest number, which I think is a very nice way of thinking about what then became this kind of Nordic model of this very strong economy that would actually have key cultural values baked into it, so social justice and equality baked into the DNA of the country at the same time as commerce and economy. So that was fantastic, and we know that led to then many, many things. Sweden being a leader in terms of climate change policies, in terms of, as I said, social justice and equality, also having incredibly successful businesses, incredibly successful social movements, and so on. We know now, though, that we are in a different age, not just Sweden, but everywhere. And we can see it in Sweden when we look at, this is my favorite sign from the school strike, make the climate Greta again, which I think is very clever, funny, and meaningful. And we can also see Extinction Rebellion in London last week the last month almost, closing down huge chunks of London. This thing is happening for real now, and I don't think we'll get there, in short, by taking the old approach. The old approach that created a high carbon economy is unlikely to be the answer to fixing a high carbon economy, to produce a zero carbon or a carbon positive even economy. And just to continue this cheery note, there's an amazing book called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, which is worth reading if you really want to scare yourselves into doing something. And the opening line is, "It's as worse, much worse than you think." So not just in terms of the scale, but also the speed with which we need to address climate crisis in particular, i.e. 10 years or thereabouts, as I'm sure most of you have an understanding of. And then in a sense, as he said, the slowness is a problem. So as someone, a colleague of mine in Finland put it the other day, it's not denialism that's the problem now, it's delayism. So watch for another D emerging fairly soon. Equally, to continue the cheery note, we have a health crisis. Our diet is now the biggest killer, essentially, globally, in terms of diseases. It's more than smoking or alcoholism and so on. So that's recent data as well. So what do we do about that? Well, as Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State under a slightly more acceptable US government, a few years ago put it, we have 21st century challenges, but we're evaluating them with 20th century ideas and responding with 19th century tools. And if we look at, let's say, again, that middle way that emerged there, that's a great example of an incredibly successful 20th century model. So how does that then translate into a new Nordic model for the 21st century is what we're dealing with here. We're unlikely to be able to fix it in the old way. And we have to really look hard at ourselves and say, has policy making fundamentally changed. This is from 1600, this picture. I could have picked any. This is England and Spain negotiating after one of our many wars, I think. Sometimes I think this is just a picture of a specialist bar in Södermalm, but it is actually an old picture. But many of us in the room could probably fit into this picture as white men with beards and grey hair. But still, policy making is still coloured in those terms very much. And it means that you can't then plan and predict in the same way. You can't have a planning and predicting approach in quite the same way. That kind of policy making is based around planning and predicting a predictable world. We're not in a predictable world anymore. And sometimes that can have happy outcomes through bad policy making. This is the the UK government's prediction of solar cell take-up in the UK. This was the low one, this was the medium one. What actually happened was this. Over the years, as soon as solar cells became broadly within price point, then why would you not have solar energy? I mean, it's completely makes sense in almost every way to a citizen. But from a policy-making perspective, they thought absolutely no way will that happen, because they're locked into a small room with a bunch of white men with beards, basically. So that's kind of a nice outcome out of bad policy making. It could have happened a lot quicker. I mean, the UK is nothing to look at in terms of policy making right now, obviously. So let's move on. The other thing could be the effect of technology hitting us. So this is Uber and Lyft's impact on average traffic speed in Manhattan. And that's one of the many issues. I mean, increased congestion, never mind the labor practices of some of those companies, but particularly just even from a mobility, just the most narrow view of transport even, Uber and Lyft are problematic, those kinds of ride-sharing companies. So the question is, what does policymaking do about that? They appear from nowhere, just as you can see the scooters outside on the streets in Stockholm and Swedish cities. They appear within months, sometimes at mass, or en masse, at scale. And the traditional approach to policymaking can't really handle that. So you can produce something which is a very good piece of user experience, like Uber is, a very good app, it works well, but it's not a good outcome when it comes to the city. There are 25,000 Ubers in London in the middle of London on a Friday night, which is way out of proportion to what that city was designed for. So not to say that technology is necessarily a bad thing. I'm a technologist in a way, deep down. These autonomous shuttles could be profoundly interesting. This one's running around Helsinki right now. That's not a live feed from Helsinki. I'm not that good. It's a video of somewhere in Helsinki, I think near the zoo. But they're kind of on the public transport system already. They're potentially really interesting because they're slow and because they do particularly sort of funny little last kilometer trips around the neighborhood, little awkward things here and there. The kind of stuff that people use their car for, actually, that last bit, the bit that public transport doesn't do. Redistributed renewable energy. This is a project in Australia, but solar cells on the roof, battery storage in the basement. Works perfectly well in Australia in that context, of course, but it begins to work, as we know, in Europe at scale again. All kinds of questions within that, but it's sort of they're technical questions to resolve. The really interesting one here is this is you're sharing the energy with your fellow neighbors in the blocks. So if I'm in this block here, and then say Alexander, my friend, lives in this block here, I have some spare kilowatts. He wants to watch the Champions League. Do I give him my kilowatts? Probably. He's a nice guy. But say that he made a bad cake on Sunday, very unlikely, he's a nice guy. But do I give him my kilowatts then? I mean, we've never thought about kilowatts having social value before, but if they're on the roof and they're stored in the basement and they're collectively owned by these blocks, then maybe they are. I mean, the energy comes just from the plug in the wall at the moment. We don't really know where it comes from, I guess. I don't know anybody knows where the energy comes from in this room. I don't know. Could be a hydroelectric plant, could be nuclear, I don't know, but it's somewhere else. If it's coming from here, then suddenly it's a sociology challenge, not just a physical electrons challenge, which is interesting. Cooperative, collaborative housing, super interesting. Something like 25% to 30% of all new housing stock in Zurich is being done by cooperatives without property developers. And it produces a far better, I would say, as a somewhat urban designer, outcome than with property developers, which is hard to take if you're a property developer. But it's more sustainable because people choose, if they're involved in the design of the thing, sustainable options. It builds in social fabric from day one. It's 25% cheaper because there's no property developer profit margin on board. So all of that money goes back to the residents, or they use it to make a nicer building. It's more architecturally interesting because it's built around real people and real lives and so on. Completely counter the logic of the way that we're supposed to do property development in cities. Profoundly interesting. New types of fabrication just reinforce that. Different types of governance using web-based or social media tools help that facilitate those conversations. So tech is fantastically useful to enable the kind of places, towns, cities, villages you might have in mind. But the question then isn't technical as such. It's not, do we have good interaction designers that can design that well? Of course. The question is political or social or cultural or policy making. That's where the innovation is, and that's sometimes hard for an innovation agency to take, one that's funded a lot of pure scientific research and technical research. Actually, the big challenge now might be on policy innovation, social innovation, the way that we make policy and so on. Hence missions. So missions have come in, and I'm going to skip through this quite quickly, apologies. With a little bit of sort of thinking about the kind of thing we mean by a national agenda around something, think sort of moonshot type stuff, because they're bold, inspirational, with wide societal relevance. So all of those depressing slides I put at the start of the presentation says, this is the way that we now need to start talking. We need to be ambitious and bold about this stuff. This is not a time to risk averse. This is a time to experiment and begin to take risks with responsibility and good conscience and carefully and thoughtfully, but we need to take risks nonetheless. Wide societal relevance. It's no longer enough just to have big industry that then pays for a welfare state, but we need to pull everything towards societal relevance. What does it mean for your mother, your father, your children, your neighbors, your cousins, whatever, in meaningful, everyday terms? We're going to tell that story. They have a clear direction, they're ambitious, multiple top-down and bottom-up solutions. So yes, top, as in politics is engaged, policy making, regulation, but multiple bottom-up, citizen engagement, citizen participation, social movement, that kind of thing. And cross-disciplinary, cross-sector, as in we can't solve these things from individual silos. We never probably could, but for a long time we could pretend that we did, or it worked quite well. Now we can't. These are all cross-sector, cross-silo things, even the things I just quickly showed you. And the missions has come with that sort of formula. It's being used in the UK, which I was part of, as I mentioned, working with the industrial strategy. The European Commission is framing a reasonably big part of Horizon Europe, the replacement for Horizon 2020, about missions, around missions. The Netherlands announced on Friday 25 missions, which they've thought about for a while and have significant public and private funding behind it. So we're not alone in this conversation here. There are lots of people beginning to move in that direction because of this sense of relevance and urgency and the ability to pull multiple actors together, top down, bottom up. Sort of examples around. It's hard because this is something that's new, and people always say to me, where's it been done before? Can you just give me like the book of case studies? And I'm like, well, at some point you have to do something for the first time. This, particularly in innovation, someone has to take a step, half a step forward. And that's what we're talking about now. But there are sort of precedents. You can see the Energiewende in Germany is a little bit like that. Sets a clear target, 40% reduction, carbon neutral by 2050. It's tracking not exactly towards that, but it's heading in that direction, put it that way. Very clear direction. Built on lots of different things, particularly not just top-down things like reorganizing the steel industry and creating financial subsidies from an act of parliament, but also the green movement in Germany having decades and decades of sort of background there, which means that there now something like 50% of the renewable energy infrastructure in the country is community-owned. It's owned by towns and villages who have built their own wind farm or solar farm and so on. That's a profoundly interesting model, top-down and bottom-up again simultaneously. You could say Vision Zero here in Sweden is, I guess that's not how it was advertised when it came out in 1998, but builds in a way, again, on this tradition, Volvo bringing seatbelts to the country in '59 after Vattenfall actually decided to, you probably all know this, you probably grow up knowing this story, Vattenfall and then Volvo introduced the three-prong seatbelt. But anyway, some years later, you can do something like Vision Zero, which is super interesting and very progressive and very powerful. Within that, I dug out this quote from Mats Åke Berlin, who talks about some of the issues here. The green bits are the interesting bits. The problem was that, not that we should have zero deaths, it's actually political economists couldn't find a way of valuing that. In a cost-benefit analysis around transport, basically the political economists would say, well, some people got to die if you're going to move things around. That's the cost-benefit. So what they said, well, if you make this civil rights, then we're taking cost-benefit off the table. No one should die. That's what we shoot for, basically, which is far more progressive. It's hard to do that with the cost-benefit analysis. The other issue is expertise as well. Some people are, an expert often is an expert in a particular thing, and to get to think broadly around how you achieve people not dying because of mobility, that's going to take, as Philip and I were talking this morning, thousands of different actions from multiple angles, not just, let's say, you can make people not die by building massive barriers next to every road. That wouldn't be a very nice place to live, though, so you need to approach this with lots and lots of different ways simultaneously. The issue, of course, is that things change and you need to continually run this. So this is pedestrian deaths in the US, dropping, and then rocketing back up in the last few years. I don't know what the stats here are in Sweden, but a lot of this is to do with SUVs, just SUVs alone, which are a much bigger thing to hit a person, basically. So it's not like you can just set the target and then walk away and say, okay, see you in 50 years, hope you solve that carbon thing. It's an ongoing process, continually. You could argue that the Millennium-programmet was also a sort of a mission. It wasn't described as that. Obviously, there's good sides to these things, bad sides to these things, but it's nonetheless impressive to produce 1,006,000 homes in 9 years. And of course, the Apollo is the canonical idea of the mission. You set a target, clear goal, and then 25% of the US population is involved in making that happen one way or another. Everybody from innovating in spacesuit material to rocket fuel to what astronauts eat to doing the maths, so all of that is very impressive. So the idea behind missions is that there is a direction to it. They use politics here to imply things have a direction. You can produce a zero carbon economy, a carbon positive economy. It's a direction behind that. You can produce a high carbon economy. So in the UK, we work through these things in small groups. There's Mariana there in the background telling me what to do, quite rightly. And to some extent, those teams looked a little bit like, if we put people in the room here, you'd have a bunch of experts and some academics and a couple of politicians and so on. Some representatives from civil society, and where it got actually interesting was that Mariana got Brian Eno, the musician, involved as part of the steering group. I don't know if you know about Brian Eno, but he's a very famous musician. And to have a musician in the group around things like mobility and health is profoundly useful, I have to say, given the way that he is a particular kind of musician anyway. He could just ask the oblique question that the experts never asked, which was so interesting in itself. So where we are at the moment is moving in this direction. We're not saying we can do this anymore. We can't just say make prosperity happen and then we pay for the issues to do with prosperity. That's not massive simplification of 150 years of amazing progress, but two boxes. It worked incredibly well, but now we have to basically all pull in this direction, particularly around these key issues here. Climate and health are both in different types of crisis. Healthcare, we've sort of built for 20th century health issues, if you like, acute diseases, breaking your leg, being in a war. You'd go to a hospital, you'd be out of a hospital. The issue we're dealing with now is obesity, diabetes, cancer, all of these sort of issues. These are long-term lifestyle related things that you don't go to hospital, or if you do go to hospital, you're there for 15 years or so. We can't do that anymore. So where we've been scoping out in Vinnova internally is a set of potential mission areas. So these are not officially ratified Swedish government areas that we're all going to pull behind yet. This is us testing the ground on this thing. What would it mean to do missions in these areas? You can see preventative health in here. You can see different types of mobility, different types of cities implied in there, or towns, or different ways of living together. They are delivered through our investments, our infrastructure, our capabilities, entrepreneurial public sector, social innovation, private sector, infrastructure, industry, digital product design, service design. All of those things have to be in place. Genuinely responsible use of the environment in a properly circular way. So using forestry to produce products in the best sense. Human and machine learning, the best it can be. And then 21st century Swedish and Nordic values as kind of a modifier running across all of those things. Because every other country also has these things, by the way. Maybe not every country has as many trees as us, but still. Finland sort of does. Russia kind of does. Anyway, every other country has a lot of these other boxes. The key question is, how do we put this together in a Swedish way, in a Nordic way? What does it mean to do that? That's interesting because it gives us an advantage, actually. When we talk about machine learning, we probably won't have the best machine learning in the world. Technically, that'll almost certainly be China because of the significant investment in that direction, way more than Silicon Valley. But we might have the open, legible, trustable, responsible machine learning. That would be a sort of Volvo doing seatbelts kind of thing to do, but with machine learning. That would be a Swedish thing to do, therefore. That's interesting, and we can do business on those terms. We can run the place on those terms. So those enablers are kind of pulled in this direction. We don't just have a public sector for fun. We have a public sector because we need healthy Swedes. We don't just have a private sector just because it's quite nice to run companies. No, it's because we want to make zero carbon products and services. So they pull in that direction like that. They have systemic relationships. You can begin to look at them as a portfolio like this. I won't go into the detail, but just know that we're bringing up now working definitions of what it might be to develop missions in these areas. We have teams working on them internally at Vinnova. Don't be surprised if you get called up by someone from Vinnova asking you about this, or rather get in touch with us if you want to get involved, because this is an inclusive, open process. That's the way that we get there on this. Again, not like the bunch of men with beards in a room, he says, as a man with a beard in a room. So we can work across them. This is an example, you know, if we had preventative health, a key thing there might be getting healthy food in all public schools and kindergartens. That would be an interesting thing to do, depending on what we mean by healthy food, but that would be profoundly systematic change across the country, which is also in the Healthy Sustainable Food mission, which means that we can look at it as a key pivot point. It kind of sits in between these things here, because it's in both of those. So we start running this thing as a portfolio of systemic interventions or acupuncture points in that way. So it gives us a clue that actually what kids eat in kindergartens and schools might be something profoundly interesting to invest in, or to do innovation around, or to research and learn from. So let me talk a little bit about techniques and tactics. And I'll draw a bit from work that we did in Helsinki here. This was a project that actually Marco Steinberg, who's at the room, and who's at the back of the room, and I did together. We were looking at food, low carbon food in Helsinki, and simultaneously this social movement emerged on the street. It's called Ravintolapäivä. I'll roll this back a little bit. People were so annoyed that they couldn't open up a street food joint or a simple small cafe. The regulations were so intense to fill in. The environmental health regulations were so high. No one could really innovate in that sector. It was almost as if the innovation had been deleted entirely by the regulation. And the regulation had an idea of what food was like in Finland in 1986 in mind, more or less, which is sausages for drunk people late at night, more or less, simplifying. But if that's kind of what it was. And it was encoded pretty much in the regulation. And some people decided to try and change that. They couldn't change it. So what they did was they said, okay, everybody in the room, open up a street food joint, make food in your home, in your apartment, and sell it out of your front door or apartment window on Saturday. They can't arrest us all, basically. Which is not a very Finnish thing to do, but that's what happened. So this woman is making egg and bacon sandwiches in her first floor window, lowering them to the street. You put €5 in the basket, because it's an expensive place, Helsinki, and you get an egg and bacon muffin, which was an amazing innovation, I can tell you. It wasn't possible before. It's completely illegal. She is a criminal. She has no regulation. She has no not a shred of documentation to say that she can do any of those things. This woman is an Argentinian woman making empanadas, the Argentinian street food. This woman is dressed as an empanada to advertise the empanada. That's my son. I had no idea there was an Argentine living there. It was kind of fantastically nice to see the city open up in this way. This is a Thai soup kitchen in the park. Again, all of these people are criminals. They should be thrown in jail. Can't possibly be thrown in jail, obviously, because it's so nice. It's so clearly a good thing. It's so clearly good urbanism. Criminals. And they just, they organized this, self-organized it using Facebook, because that's, a weapons grade level tool for organizing, basically. They built 4 mobile apps in one weekend hackathon across all the major platforms. Imagine doing that through public procurement. It would take longer than 2 days, I can guarantee. That showed you the scale of all of these things. These are all of the pop-ups that started happening. It ran every 4 months for about 4 years, I think, and spread to 40 countries worldwide. It became this phenomenon. So what we did was said, well, we don't need to teach people how to cook. They know how to cook. What we need to teach them how to do is to open up a cafe to break into the system. And then how do we get the system to understand what's going on? That was our role here, working again top down as a bit of government almost, working on policy and regulation, and then bottom up on the street with citizens, people trying to do things. So we worked with the city of Helsinki. I'll skip this a bit actually. And we got people to pitch for a 3-week training camp. So it was a bit like MasterChef, essentially. You got to work, in fact, with the top chefs in Helsinki. And these are the people that got through the process. And it wasn't, again, teaching them how to cook necessarily, although it looks a bit like that. It was how to find a restaurant, how to hire a team, how to organize a menu, how to fill in the forms. It was very successful in its own way. We worked with Anto Niemi, top chef in the city, and many others. We wrote a book about street food culture. And crucially, we worked with Ville Relander, the food culture project manager for the city of Helsinki. So he could understand firsthand, who are these people? What are they trying to do? Why are they finding it so hard? What do we need to do to change our process and regulation as a result in order to make this thing more widespread? So long story short, lots of things happened out of that process. These don't bother to read them, but this is a slow opening up and what a kind of a flowering of understanding around street food in Helsinki. I'd say all of it is low carbon, pretty much sustainable and organic, and often locally produced, because again, if you pull people into that, that's what kind of things happen, to be honest. Not again what policymakers think, but that's what tends to happen. We can't claim any credit for that at all. I'd say Marco and I necessarily, and our colleagues at Citra, but some credit perhaps. But it's a very wiggly line between this, and also this stuff was citizen organized. I mean, that's where the real credit should go in a way. But again, it's still a blurry line. Now, trying to get that through a kind of a cost-benefit analysis, cause and effect policy-making process, almost impossible. Which kind of says, tell us what's going to happen before you go into it. Tell us what you're going to do and what the outcome might be. How much is that going to cost? And what resources do you need exactly? I need to know now. Cannot happen with this kind of innovation. Another example. We wanted to make this block, which is a neighborhood block, a new way of living and working and building in Helsinki. The key thing, there were many innovations going on here, was that it's cross-laminate timber, so it's all made of wood, all made of timber. Huge opportunities in Sweden around that, as you can imagine, we're the second biggest sawn wood exporter in the world. Pretty much all goes elsewhere without us doing the interesting bit, I'd say, which is actually turning it into meaningful products and services, in this case, low carbon, if not carbon positive. We wanted to make that, and we were prepared to bankroll it, and we organized a competition around it as an innovation agency. The key thing was that we found a bit into the project that the building code didn't allow a cross-laminate timber building. A timber building was sort of verboten under the law because it hadn't really been updated. Slightly different here, but that was the case in Finland. So crucially, Citra's lawyers worked with other lawyers to change the building code, basically, one way or another. And now the project kind of happening. It's probably half timber, or half what we wanted it to be, I'd argue. But it's now part of a much bigger development, also called Wood City, which is going on in the downtown harbour development called Jätkäsaari. There are other projects going along. This isn't formally timber structurally, but has a ton of timber in it. That's the new library in Helsinki. There's a lot of wood around town emerging, which wasn't there 8 or 9 years ago. This is the sauna in Helsinki. And these are cross-laminate timber for some unnecessary reason with a brick veneer on. I don't know why, but anyway. But inside, structurally, that's all cross-laminate timber. So after changing the law, you change the code. And the code is like code. The clue is in the name. Building code is really the code that writes the city, like computer code. So you're looking for those kind of system change possibilities. Don't just make the exception. How can I change my one building? But how do we also then change the code that writes the city? Crucially, that's not then just an urban development project, it's also a new trajectory for the forestry industry or the timber industry, which is huge in Finland as it is in Sweden. High value, high tech products from timber, not paper and pulp, put it that way. So that again doesn't come from a traditional process of say, okay, this is an energy program, we're nothing to do with forestry, or this is a forestry program, we're not to do with urban development and building codes. You know, this was actually cutting across those. So I'm really aware of time, so I'm going to just like skip right ahead to somewhere randomly. Let's see where it pops up. Okay, I'll do one last bit. I just want to show then the way that this implies working differently. Oh, come on. PowerPoint. Do I have 5 minutes then? All right. Yes, no, I know, exactly. I do too. So let me show you then a way of doing this kind of different strategy and policy work, which is this more iterative, ongoing process. In Melbourne, long story short, we worked on a kind of a sketch of how this street could transform. This street, as you can see, is incredibly wide. Actually, many streets in Stockholm, or certainly Gothenburg, are like this as well. Kind of parking, actually. It's sort of a street, but it's actually a parking lot, kind of pretending to be a street. You can't really see a person in there. There's just a bunch of cars getting hot in the sun. So how do you change that? It's an interesting question. So the first thing we did was, so let's start gathering some data about it, and also some Wi-Fi tends to attract people, a bit like honeypot in that sense. But we start pulling people down to it. We start understanding the patterns that they get left behind. Crucially looking at security, privacy, anonymity, opt-out ability, all of those things massively important, but that's a whole separate talk. Angle the cars on this side. You notice before they were linear. If you angle them, you can then open up the bike lane over here, which is a little iterative move. You start changing the mobility options. Then we can start pulling in this here. This then becomes a pickup thing for this autonomous shuttle, like you said in Helsinki. Let's just try that, see how it goes. We don't know how it goes, so we need to do prototypes, test beds, demonstrators. Might not work, so let's give it a go. Then we can start pulling the planting in. As you can see, we can start borrowing bits of road here. You can still drive down there, by the way, but still. Until you can make this big move here, and then you can do this here and so on. And at this point now, you've completely transformed the street. You're now talking about a place which is healthier, because people are moving. It's soaking up stormwater more effectively because it's green. It's lowering the urban heat island effect in summer because it's cooler. The business rates and property rates have gone up if you want them to. There's more business happening in the first place. There's still cars in the background should you wish to have one of those. But now there's many more choices for getting around, as you can see. Here we've gone for shared surface instead of bike lanes. There's a number of ways you can do it. But still, what you can't do, though, is just jump from this to this, because people in Melbourne will kill me if they do that. You know, that's their human rights, they believe, to park their car there. So you can't just jump straight to that. So what we need to do is talk about this kind of iterative, ongoing, adaptive process. You have a North Star any one time, which is your kind of, what are our targets or metrics? Not in terms of what concrete are you planning to use, which is the way that planning currently goes, but how healthier do you want people? How much do you want kids to run around by? How clean would you like the air to be? What do you want the footfall to go up by? The outcomes. And you can hold those things and test them as you're going through it. They always give you this guiding light, but moving in this way is more like navigating a small boat through a harbor. You know, it's kind of, let's do regular compass readings and check our way as we go. It's a completely different process to, let's say, current planning, which I'm not going to say any more about. So you can spread the cost, so the expensive stuff is at the end, the cheap stuff is at the front. You can bring people with you, crucially. That's another thing about design and mission space work, because it's bottom up as well as top down. This gives you a chance to do this step by step with people on board. And that can be as quick as you want it to be. If you bring people with you as part of the process, it's actually quicker than doing a traditional planning process and then having people complain. So there's that. Well, so the speed and urgency is on board, top down, bottom up, etc., etc. I think I better pause there because I could go on for another 4 days, but I don't think I should. So I'll leave it there, and then please, any questions, comments, happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I'd like to open up for questions. I'm sure that many of you are sitting and wondering about things. Any?
I'll skip to the last slide. There, I made it.
In that case, let me. Oh, we have one here. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you. It was incredibly interesting.
Thank you.
Please also introduce yourselves.
My name's Heather Marshall-Heyman. I work for Swe Life. What I wonder is how, if Vinnova is going to change the way they are thinking, or trying to encourage the rest of Sweden to change the way they're thinking about innovation, then how will, I mean, at the moment, the financial structure, the way you sort of apply for a grant at Vinnova is, here's what we want to do, here's the end of it, this is all the stuff we're going to do in the middle, and this is how much it's going to cost, as you were...
Did I accidentally critique my organization?
So my question is, and I mean, that's worked fine.
Yeah, and it's how it works everywhere.
Yes. Is that something that you are looking to change at Vinnova, and in which case, have you any suggestions, or can you tell us how that's going to?
Yeah, so what we're embarking on now is with colleagues of mine like Andrea and Tobias and Philip and Caroline and others in the room, is a 3-month design process that we want to work through with collaborators. So external collaborators, could be people like you, to work through how do we do this? Because there is a sort of emerging theory about missions, but the detail of the practice on the ground is the least resolved bit of that. So absolutely funding, and the way that funding works, and the way that application works, and partnerships and collaboration has to be up for grabs within that too, because the way that we do it is actually probably the most important thing about what we do in the short term. We can come up with a fancy mission statement for preventative health or zero carbon mobility, but this is as much about innovating in the process by which we come together as anything. So I would just say from our side, yes, we are actively exploring basically anything that we can do within the assignment that we get from the government is up for grabs. And the assignment we get from the government is relatively broad, actually. So we're talking to other agencies about how we collaborate together across boundaries and borders in ways that we have done in the past as well, but we're now going to do it with more vigor. That includes private sector organizations. We'll be wanting to do something more around public engagement and demonstration projects, citizen engagement and so on. All of those are really different, I would say, for Vinnova. I'm new here, but I think I get enough nods from my colleagues. So we would love to talk to you more if you have feedback on the way that things currently work, but also if people want to get involved in helping us think this through. That's the best answer I can give at this point.
Great. Anybody else? Maybe I should just, if nobody has maybe I should just play a little bit of devil's advocate here.
Oh, great.
Because, I mean, we've been talking about grand challenges ever since, well, for a long time, at least since the Lund Declaration in 2009, or and Vinnova has been working with challenge-driven innovation. So is this just a new buzzword like Emperor's New, or what is really the difference now in approach?
Yeah, you can't really see if it's a new buzzword at this point. I mean, clearly it's around, but until we actually put it into practice and we find out how hard and how different it is, that would be the time to answer that question. If we find that we go for 3-4 months and then we find actually we're still in business as usual mode, then it's a problem and it hasn't changed much. But yeah, we want to actively turn it into not a buzzword. Yeah. So that's on us, or on you, Anne, as well. Yeah. So there's that. I think challenge-driven is potentially one of the most useful tools we can use within missions. So to be clear, missions is something that gives us an umbrella, like a much richer toolkit. Some of those things might look like existing Vinova calls. There's nothing wrong with that at all for when we have a clearly defined target area and there's a bunch of actors that can resolve that, then absolutely let's use that tool. So I'm not saying we have to reinvent everything here at all. We have a UDI program, challenge-driven innovation. It's fantastically good at what it does. So what we're just trying to say is let's step back and try and get the question framed in the best possible way, and then see what's the richest possible toolkit now that we can use to solve these really big things. Challenge-driven has been massively useful in certain areas in the way it's been used. So we'll continue to use it for sure. Andreas and I are talking all the time about that. But missions gives us a chance to also say, so what else alongside policy lab work, anticipatory regulation? How do we change that? Citizen participation projects, pure R&D, all of those things are also relevant around any one of these questions. So think of it as a toolkit organized under a mission, but that's where we are.
My way of looking at it is usually as each project is like a vector, heading in a certain direction. And if we are more clever and more insightful at showing the direction to which we want to go, then maybe we can get all these vectors to align a little bit more and get an accelerated change in that direction instead of having just purely bottoms up in a sort of a more general direction.
No, absolutely. That's why
my mind.
I use these kind of examples.
Picture in my mind, at least.
Absolutely.
Primitive view of looking at it.
No, that's not at all. Yeah. I think using an example like this, you can kind of, once we get down to the reality of it, we can say, do you want your kids breathing clean air or not? Okay. And then within that, we know that's going to take regulation, financial innovation, architectural innovation, citizen involvement. It's going to take a few challenges and some calls, multiple things. But we can have that direction to turn villages, towns, cities, countryside into better versions of themselves that are zero carbon, healthy, addressing climate crisis properly. That's the goal here, I think.
Great. Another question here, Olga.
Thank you. Olga Cordes, Program Director for Viable Cities. Thank you very much, Dan. Actually, I wanted to ask you about this picture, but still, I've seen it already once.
I know, exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, it's good with you. You are saying the same thing, and then you are thinking differently afterwards. Because it's very rich. But so what struck me now, okay, it's really good, interesting example. But my question is, how would you scale up this experience? How many of the streets in Melbourne has been changed like that after this experiment? Is it one pilot, one perfect street a change, or this was used for other streets? How can we scale up those experiences?
Yeah. So in Melbourne, that absolutely was one pilot. Very simple as that. You have to start with one or two. The system change comes in when you do things like as I showed with the cross-laminate timber, the building code, policy, regulatory change. That's when you can really significantly change across the piece. So the program that Olga runs, for those that don't know, is looking at 8 key cities simultaneously and exchanging knowledge across them. So I would want to see that program running, for instance, in every one of those cities and a whole bunch of small towns in between those things. Starting and sharing, you could start this summer, I'd suggest. And in doing so, though, you're flushing out what is the issue with changing the system. And the issue with changing the system in that picture in Sweden, my very brief understanding from talking to much smarter people that know about it, like Philip, the parking space, the street space is organized at the national level, at the Regeringskansliet level, using a law that was initiated in 1957, has been updated a couple of times, but clearly has a very different idea of mobility still in its DNA. Like, that's why I showed the street food example in Helsinki. I kind of had sausages as the idea. And now it turns out people like falafels and sushi as well. So we need to use that to then say, okay, why is this bit here under that national law? And it can be fine if it's under a national law, because then if you can change that, the whole country changes. And we need to do a demonstrator to build the demand for that. Because a politician can't change the law at this level until he or she sees that actually most people want their kids to breathe clean air, it turns out. Surprise. then we have enough remit to change the law. Then change the law, then you get a system change. So we're looking at these instances in order to change the system. And that's, as you know, what usually doesn't happen. Usually you're contracted to design the instance, the one-off. As a, again, I used to work in this world. You get the contract to redesign that street. You don't get the contract to redesign all the streets in the country. But all the streets in the country are under that law piece. So that's what's so powerful about working in this mission-oriented way, potentially, is that we can stimulate discussions and demonstrators and really powerful projects on the ground in places that also flush out the top-down side of things, political leadership, ambition, and the regulatory level at the same time. And that top-down, bottom-up thing that's super powerful, and it's very rarely done.
Good. And a last question, and then I think we have to wrap up to be respectful of your time also.
Sorry.
We clearly need to talk more afterwards.
No, I was actually thinking to ask you about the European Commission's missions.
Yeah.
Because this is, as you know, been debated a lot and discussed a lot, and it kind of boiled down after lots and lots of very good suggestions to, what, a handful, 5?
Five, yeah.
And, I just wonder whether, looking at your picture earlier on, there was a number, rather many more missions in Little Sweden compared to the whole of Europe.
Yeah.
And I just wonder whether the European way of looking at it is a little bit... are they thinking a bit too big, or why only 5 is my question, I suppose.
I think that they're fairly broad. So one of the 5, for instance, is societal transformation. So climate change, adaptation, and societal transformation, I think, is the full name. So I could read any project into that title, I think. Another one is soil health. Another one is water quality. They're a bit more specific, but again, they're actually pretty broad. I think cancer is one of the most specific, but even within cancer, there's preventative health to do with preventing cancer in the first place, and there's a ton of work to do with acute care and so on. So although they have, in a slightly reductive way, come down to 5, I think they think of them as kind of a framework that we can hopefully pitch our national priorities against. And that's a conversation we're having, by the way. That's interesting dialogue. As I say, the Netherlands has currently gone for 25 missions as of last week. So maybe that's too many. I don't know. We kind of hovering around 9 at this point, but until we actually get into a deeper conversation with our colleagues in other ministries and agencies, those 9 are kind of a draft.
And just to be clear, we're still talking about missions areas.
Yeah.
The specific mission is
same with the European Commission.
Exactly. So that's this whole process that's now going to take a few months to actually pin it down. So what is really the mission, so that we can be much more pointed.
I think at this stage, all I find heartening is that when we talk to the EC about it, our contact there, who's high up in research, talked about it being like a Copernican revolution in terms of the way the Commission thinks about stuff, because this is not sitting in the current DG silos. For those of you know about European funding, it doesn't sit under MOVE, it doesn't sit under Sante. This is a research budget which is across the piece. That in itself is a huge achievement if they get that over the line.
So with this final comment on the European
Copernican
Union,
revolution.
I'm afraid we have to close today's seminar. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for those of you who are watching on the web. Don't forget to tune in June 27th for our next seminar in the series Öppna upp för innovation. Thank you very much.